It's springtime, or at least it's the colloquial definition of spring here, being the 1st of September. So that means more beach photos and more jet ski photos and everything else coming very soon, which I know everybody loves, right? But in all seriousness, it's so nice sort of getting that time of year where we get to summer. I mean, winter was terrible. We got down to single digits Celsius sometimes. I had to put a jumper on more than once. So we're glad to be getting out of that. But it is nice to sort of see the change of seasons and hopefully get back in the pool, because it is actually a little bit too cold here during the winter to be in the pool. So they are the big things that we are thinking about as of today. Now, other things. I am sporting a little bit of an injury. For those of you looking on the video, I had what can only be referred to as getting hit in the face by Dodgeball yesterday as I went to my son's Father's Day event, which was good fun. He goes to a boys' school, so there's lots of boys and lots of dads and everything. And we did have a father-son dodgeball match, which got very, very serious. The reason I'm sporting the injury is I was wearing my sunnies, and one of the dads managed to just smack me right in the face. I did seek retribution on a couple of 7-year-olds though, so I do feel better for that. I think that everything has sort of evened out now. And fortunately, it was nothing too serious. So they are the sort of trivial fun things at the beginning of what is going to be a very long talk about a lot of stuff that is going to be a lot more serious. But before I jump into that, and inevitably we talk about spam lists and things like that, next week I will be in Melbourne, Australia. For those of you from other parts of the world, it means I drive down the road half an hour, jump on a plane, I fly 2 hours, which is lovely because that's really, really close compared to what I normally do. So I'll be down there in Melbourne doing my workshop. It is the last public one that I have planned for this year. If you're in Melbourne, or if you know people in Melbourne, get along to that. It's being run by OWASP, who are not for profit, so it is also the cheapest one I've ever seen done. So I will drop some notes in for that, and we've still got some slots there, so I hope we fill those out over the next, what do we got? Next 6 days before I do it. So also I'll be coming from Melbourne next week, and I'll try and find somewhere nice down there. The big thing about Melbourne for the international people is coffee. so that works really well for me. I'll be very happy about that. So I'll be in Melbourne next week. I'll put the notes for that workshop, and I hope we can get some people filling that one out. Now, I'm going to be looking at some notes here because I've got a lot of points I want to talk about here. And it relates to the big thing I wrote this week, which at least in terms of traffic volumes has become the biggest thing I've ever done, which was kind of unexpected. In fact, there are many, many superlatives involved here in terms of this incident. And this, of course, is the onliner spam bot set of data. And I've written a bit about this, and look, it's not a particularly long blog post and it's fairly high level. I want to talk a lot about it today to give more background and also to try and respond to the constant queries of the same nature I got over and over again. And I want to try and explain things in a very clear way here with all the sort of emotion and personality, I guess, that you get from video and audio. Because I don't know if it always comes across in writing. Some of it probably looks a bit blunt. So, background first. I had a guy contact me last week while I was snowboarding, which means I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. Guy contacted me, a guy with a name or an alias. I'm not sure because it's a foreign name, but the alias is Ben Cow, BENKOW _ at the end on his Twitter. He, as I understand, he's a French bloke, malware analyst, legitimate guy, very nice guy too, from all the discussions I've had with him. And he has written some really interesting things in the past about analysing spam bots. So these are services which do a combination of aggregating large numbers of email addresses and then sending out spam. So you know how in your, hopefully in your junk mail, every now and then in your inbox, you have copious amounts of Viagra spam and Nigerian prince spam and all the other bullshit that ends up getting sent to you. It is totally automated via tools such as this. And what he'd actually written about here over the past, and then he wrote something specifically related to this incident. What he'd written about is how the individuals or individual managing this service sort of puts it together, how they manage it, how they accumulate lists. He'd gone through and had a look at how some of their code was written as well, which was it wasn't very good. It's no way to sugarcoat it. It was just terrible sort of business logic and obfuscation and attempts at security, which is interesting that people sort of working in the space of violating the privacy and security of others can be so bad at it themselves. Regardless, have a read of the post. I'll put links into that as well. And anyway, so we get onto this online spam bot, and he's identified by looking at the way some of this malware is executing and how it's actually sending messages. He's identified an IP address and a path under which were 180 something files. And these files were not sort of a consistent format. It wasn't sort of nice CSV, comma delimited sort of stuff. It was a bunch of different stuff that had everything from one file was about 14 gig, just email address by email address, line by line. Gazillions of them, mine included. Mine was in there twice. Once in that file, once in a smaller file. There were other files that had email address and password pairs. There were other files that had email address, password, SMTP server that inevitably was related to a mail account using those credentials and an SMTP port. Other files that were kind of almost junk. So I give an example in the blog post where there's one from RMS here in our neighbouring state, Roads and Maritime Service. And it was just like an RMS string and then all of these email addresses after that. And I think it wasn't sales at, but it was something like sales at and then just guessing domains. So a really, really broad structure of different data, huge volume of it, totaled I think 35 gigabytes or something. It's in the blog post. And once I went through it and extracted out all of the email addresses, which I can do with regex, by the way. So this is what makes it easy to get email addresses out. So I went through, got them all out. It distilled down to 711 million unique email addresses, which makes it the largest single incident by far that I've loaded into Have I Been Pwned. Now before that, the largest one was the exploit IN database. That was the high 500 millions. So this was more than 100 million more than that, which was just a massive thing. Now, let's touch on a few things here. So first of all of this data in this spam bot onliner thing was used for a combination of purposes. So inevitably just raw email addresses, you're sending email to it. So this goes back to the point about your Viagra spam. You're on the list, I'm on the list. You're getting spam because there is a process somewhere picking up those email addresses and just sending messages. The other angle to it, which was really quite interesting, and he explains this in his blog post, is that for individuals running these spammers, they need to try and deliver spam to people. And for that, they need mail servers. Now, the prevalence of open SMTP mail servers where any spammer can just go and drop into it and send mail from is not real good these days. So if they can find credentials that they can use on other people's SMTP servers, even Yahoo's or Gmail's, then that's a really good thing. So inevitably, part of this list of data was mail servers that they could send mail from. So you're sort of getting owned two ways here. You've got one way, which is you're in a list, which means you're going to get spam. The other way is there's a bunch of people there with credentials, and it's going to be their accounts that they're connecting to SMTP servers with to send you junk. And then inevitably that would be distributed out to all sorts of compromised machines within a botnet, which could then connect to SMTP servers so it didn't all come from one place. Or they'll go out through proxies or all the usual sort of source obfuscation techniques. So massive list of data. Now, in terms of loading it into Have I Been Pwned, late last year, I introduced the concept of spam lists. And I sort of wasn't sure what to do at the time. And in fact, from memory, when I wrote the blog post, I said, look, I've had some of these massive spam lists for quite some time, but it's not a data breach, right? So your account didn't get hacked out of somewhere else. It doesn't fit the usual definition of what I would do with Have I Been Pwned. Now, the thing about it, though, is when I thought about it, I went, well, some of these spam lists actually have a lot of personal data. So the ones at the time would have things like your address, your phone number. Some of the ones I've loaded would have things like the company that you work for. And I sort of went, well, look, if it was me and I knew that data was out there, or I knew someone had that data, I'd kind of like to know. So, you know, perhaps in your circumstances, you'd say, hey, Troy, if you find me in a spam list, I'd actually like to know that my data has been redistributed and abused in this fashion. And that was sort of my theory. So I did a Twitter poll, again, late last year, and 85% of people said, I would like to know if I've appeared in a spam list. 15% of people said no, they wouldn't want to know. So, okay, that's an overwhelming majority, and I introduced the concept of spam lists. And over time, there's been various records that I've added, or various incidents I've added, that are from spam lists. Now, this is one of those. So I just wanted to sort of make it clear first that this wasn't sort of on a whim, hey, here's 711 million accounts, let's load it. This was carefully thought out, polled, overwhelmingly positive response, something I've done multiple times now. This just happens to be the biggest one. So that was sort of the start of it. Now, I'll talk about reactions and things a little bit later. We'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of all this first. So getting that many records into Have I Been Pwned took a lot of cloud. so I've written a lot in the past about the processes of how I load data, so I won't go into it here. But it took in total about a day and a half. Ironically, around about, I think it was about somewhere between 4 and 6 hours of that was just uploading the 4 gigabyte file, courtesy of our Australian internet connection, which only gets me 2 megabits up. So that was fun, but even from there, look, I just had multiple instances of machines running a very large SQL database to crunch stuff before picking it up and chucking it in table storage. Bunch of crunching and processing and everything else. After the data was loaded, I emailed more than 300,000 people. There were, from memory, just off the top of my head, there was about 280,000 individual Have I Been Pwned subscribers who were in the data. And I think it was about 22,000. I tweeted the stats actually a few days ago. About 22,000 people monitoring domains, and then aliases in their domains had been impacted. So a huge number of people got notified. This had a very direct impact on my traffic stats. And I saved a couple of stats here that I noted down because I thought some people might find these interesting. First of all, when I sent the notifications out, there were links to the blog post that I wrote. I sent the notifications out. A lot of people found out about it. A lot of media found out about it. I had the biggest ever day on my blog yesterday, Thursday. I had 250,000 people yesterday. Just go to troyhunt.com, which was just a fascinatingly large number of people. And again, I had never seen that many people come to my blog. The previous high before then was Dropbox last year. So when I wrote about the Dropbox hack, when I verified it, courtesy of finding my own totally random string of characters as a password in a bcrypt hash, I wrote about that, said, hey, look, Dropbox hack is real. That was massive. So that was huge. Incidentally, August was not the biggest month on my blog. It was August 2015 that was the biggest month, which was when Ashley Madison happened. And I wrote multiple pieces. If we had a few more days in the month, I'm sure that it would have been the biggest month because today's been a massive amount of traffic as well, except as we've discussed, it's now spring and a new month. Anyway, so a massive number of people came along to my blog. Excuse me. So that was a really interesting thing, seeing that much traffic go through. Now, Have I Been Pwned got a ludicrous amount of traffic. So Have I Been Pwned saw almost 3 million visitors yesterday. Now, my previous high has been around the 1 million mark, maybe just under. So this was massively higher. And that number is fine. Look, to be honest, any sort of conceivable number is fine if I turn up enough cloud. All right, so you just keep adding cloud. The thing that made life a little bit difficult on Have I Been Pwned yesterday was that IFL Science, so I fucking love science, which is a massive, massive publication that's followed by a huge number of people. They write some really interesting stuff. They put out a piece on this whole spammer list thing and said, you know, you can go and check your things on Have I Been Pwned. And they very kindly did it at 1:45 a.m. for me yesterday morning. So I was asleep. And then I got up in the morning and I looked at my traffic stats and I went, oh, that's interesting. There is like this massive, massive sudden spike. And there were a single digit number of minutes there where I lost a bunch of requests because Azure couldn't scale fast enough to support the sudden influx of people. Now, in hindsight, I was stupid for not just adding more instances the night before, because it would have cost me single-digit dollar amounts just to go, hey, let's just run, say, 3 large instances of an Azure app service. I should have done that. I did it last night and then had much less traffic. Should have done it the night before. So, shame on me for that. But anyway, stuff scaled up. People came on and, ultimately nearly 3 million people. But that was sort of a fun exercise just from the mechanics of running a large service that gets a bunch of interest in it. I've also had, within 2 days, about 100,000 more people sign up and verify their subscriptions for the notification service. So I'm now approaching 1.5 million people that are signed up to Have I Been Pwned for notifications. So the challenge of running this service for free is becoming harder and harder, but then events like this happen and you get a bunch of donations, so, not so bad. But anyway, it is making new challenges. All right, so other things I've got to sort of go through here. The data itself. If you have a look at the comments on the blog posts, and there are many hundreds of comments on the blog post already, you'll see that a lot of people have said there's a huge amount of fake data. Now, we hear the word fake a lot lately to mean all sorts of odd things. So let me define it. There are lots of either random strings as aliases or lots of English words, such as sales, as aliases where there have never been accounts. And what this is saying to me is that there's a lot of just randomly generated email addresses that receive spam. And in fact, that has been confirmed in some of the comments. And this is where things start to get really interesting, because a number of people said, hey, there's like this random aliases, or rather random alias on my domain. I have been receiving spam to that domain. I didn't know why. Now you've sort of joined the dots, and I can see from that data breach, spam list, whatever you want to call it, I can see that that address existed in that list, and that probably explains how I'm now getting mail. So one of the really interesting things that's come out of this episode is that it has helped people understand what was going on. And that in itself, I think, is really useful for a bunch of people. Certainly that's the feedback. So there's a bunch of junk in there. So when we see that 711 million figure, we've got to keep in mind, and I did say this in the blog post, that it doesn't mean 711 million people, because that is almost all of Europe, including the kids who probably don't have email addresses. So we've got to keep that in mind. Now, I've seen that taken very out of context, which is what the press does. So I have seen press, for example, that said in Australia, 12.5 million people were impacted. Now, we've only got 24, 25 million people here, and I guarantee you that half of them were not impacted by this, because what we're seeing is a bunch of junk mail addresses. Now, it's quite feasible that a 7-figure number of Aussies were impacted, but that is a very different story. But hey, it's the press, this is what they do, they've got to get the headlines, so on and so forth. All I can do is try and lay the facts out very clearly in blog posts and then, hope that people read it, which is not always going to happen. So the aliases thing is interesting, a bunch of those in there. Now, another thing that happened here, and this increasingly happens when I load any data breach, is a bunch of people said, give me the password. Now, I want to talk a lot about this because I really want to try and explain with the emotion and character and everything why I don't do this. First of all, that particularly in an incident like this, I totally get why people are asking for the password. We don't know where this data came from. Originally, I know that it came from this IP address. Incidentally, this IP address is in the Netherlands on a hosting provider which I believe is of Russian origin, and I have been in contact with people who are working with Dutch law enforcement to get it taken down. So I really hope that goes offline. I've done everything I can with the right people there. Regardless, so we don't know where upstream it came from. When I went through and I wrote the blog post and I did some analysis, some of the lists, so some of the files that were in there, I could, with a fairly high degree of confidence, point back to specific incidents. So for example, I say, look, this one file, every random address I pulled out of there had a hit on LinkedIn. Okay, so it was LinkedIn data breach, LinkedIn, SHA-1, no salt, terrible for passwords, etc. When people find themselves in this breach, they don't know. Let me rephrase that because I don't want to, I just hesitate when I use the word breach for this. When people find themselves in this list, they don't know which breach originally occurred in order for their email address to flow into there. So I understand that they want to know what the password is so they can figure out where to protect themselves. The thing is, a bunch of accounts didn't have passwords at all. And I don't know how many had passwords and how many don't, because there is so much crap in all this data and it's spread across the 180 plus files of really wacky formats as well. So it's not like, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just a simple CSV for every file. There's different structures. Some of them have a huge amount of junk on the same line. There is no regex to just parse out a password. Someone said this to me before. They said, oh, just write a regex, suck the password out. You think about what is a regex going to look like to grab a password from randomly formatted files. It's not going to happen. It's like, it's hit and miss enough just writing regexes for emails. And if you think that sounds weird, have a Google for Troy Hunt email regex. It's not easy. I have a confidence rate that is not 100% when I apply my regex to emails. I would have one that's very close to 0% if I did it for emails. So getting the passwords out to begin with would be a nightmare. That's the first bit. Now let's say, for argument's sake, I did get them out. And let's look at the broader picture. Let's say it's not just this online or spam bot. Let's say it is something like LinkedIn. And I have a very, very nicely formatted set of email addresses and SHA-1 hashes. There are some really big reasons why I don't make passwords available for people beyond the difficulty of getting them out of this online or spam bot thing. One of the big issues is having a secure mechanism by which to deliver them to people. Some people have said just email it. Nah, it's not going to happen. I am never, ever, ever going to email people their password. Not their raw password, not their hashed password, nothing like that. Because I'm one of the guys who stands up here going, nobody should ever do that. And the people suggesting that don't understand the risk. Sometimes they say, well, it's been exposed already. What does it matter? You know, it's out there on the web. Who cares if you now email it? And this is a terrible argument because what we're saying is that someone somewhere has committed a criminal act, sucked your data out of a database, spread it around the web. They've done things that they will quite possibly go to jail for if they get caught. And because of that, it's okay to treat someone's email address and their password with total disdain. And that is just not the case. So I am not going to handle data badly just because someone else did. Terrible reason. All right, so I can't email it to people. I definitely wouldn't do anything along the lines of trying to obfuscate part of it and email it to people as well, because you can still potentially match that up to other sources. You can still potentially figure out what the values are. Nothing in terms of emailing any portion of a password should ever be done by any responsible organization. So there's that. So basically you'd have to download it. You'd have to download it over some sort of a secure connection, which means that I've got to store it. So I would have to have on my system somewhere people's passwords. I really wouldn't be able to store them in a hashed fashion. Now, this creates a real problem. So let's take a step back and think about it. First of all, you're watching this because you're probably a technical person. You probably know what a hash is. The vast majority of my people, remember, my visitors, nearly 3 million people yesterday, to have I been pwned, have got no idea what a hash is. They don't know what encryption is. They don't understand any of these security paradigms. For any sort of mechanism where I make additional data beyond email address available to people, to make that mechanism work, I would have to provide it in plain text. Now, if I provide it in plain text, it means I can't hash it. At best, I could encrypt it. And that in itself poses a whole bunch of other challenges, predominantly around things like key management. So I would have to have all of this data sitting there on a web server somewhere, not hashed in a reversible fashion. And that is an enormous risk. I mean, imagine if that goes wrong. And I am not beyond making mistakes and having stuff go wrong. Like, I'm like anyone else in that I could potentially screw it up. Hopefully I'm less likely than many people to screw it up, but we're all fallible. So I'd be sitting here on this massive treasure trove of data so that people can come along and search and pull their stuff back in the clear. And of course, it's not just passwords either. People get very, very infatuated with passwords. Have a look through the pwned websites link on the top of Have I Been Pwned and see how many different classes of data there are in different incidents. Social security numbers, passport numbers, biometric data, sexualities, sexual preferences, what your fetishes are, not necessarily yours, but say people in Ashley Madison. Do I then end up with all of that stored in a reversible fashion on a web server for people to download? That is a massive risk, and I am not debating for a moment the value to the individuals impacted in doing that. But I've said it's a massive risk, right? Like, it'd be a really, really, really serious thing to do. Now, let's imagine we'll sort of suspend all reality for a moment and say I could do that without any concern whatsoever about it being owned. The one immutable fact that we cannot escape is that as soon as I have any sort of passwords or any other sensitive data like that stored in that publicly facing system, I put myself at enormous risk of litigation. And honestly, I think a lot about this, increasingly so over time as there's more data and the service is more popular. I am worried about an individual or an organisation getting upset enough about me having this very sensitive personal information about them in this system and wanting to absolutely go to town. And I've actually had to do a bunch of things in order to try and provide myself, and by extension my family, more protection in case something like that happens. And that's just at the moment, just with email addresses, let alone if it extended to these other classes of data. And no matter how good of a technical solution you come up with, if the premise is still that I either have passwords, partial passwords, any way of figuring out the passwords stored in this online system, that risk skyrockets. And I just simply can't do that. Now, that's beyond all the extra effort and everything that's involved in even doing this in the first place. And every single time someone comes up with what they think is a good idea, and sometimes technically it is a good idea, I still come back to that same problem. So things like people say, okay, well, look, you could sort of ship a PGP key to all right, people are lost already because, again, 99% of people can barely even spell PGP, let alone know what it actually does. People will say things like, well, why don't you just indicate whether a password was present for the account or not? But again, when we look at the broader picture of incidents, the problem we've got now is that password is just one attribute. So do I go back through all the breaches and for all the new ones that come up and indicate whether your passport number was present, was your gender present, was your birth date present, on a record by record basis? Because at the moment, I just say, look, if there are birth dates, then I add it as a data class, and I say your birth date might be in there. So it would create an enormous amount of work to do that. And again, in this particular incident, the parsing out of which records had passwords and which didn't would be a nightmare. Some people say, oh, well, why don't you just take the entire row that the record was in? Well, you can't do that because a bunch of the MySQL backups actually have thousands of different records on the same row. They don't have line returns on them. So whichever way you cut it, to do anything beyond what I'm doing at the moment is not only a huge amount more work, but it also creates a huge amount of risk. And unless something fundamental changed with those two factors, nothing's going to change with the data I make available. I wanted to try and make that clear because I just keep getting request after request after request. Can I please see the data? Can you do this? Can you add this to the system? And I really hope that sort of explains why I don't do that. Now that then leads us to the next natural part of the discussion, which is that some people have said, well, this is useless to me. You know, if I don't have the password, it's absolutely useless. Well, it's not useless for multiple reasons. So one reason is, I mentioned earlier on, this has helped a bunch of people understand why they were getting spam. Why they were getting spam to addresses that never existed for the people doing domain monitoring. For a bunch of other people, they've said, okay, this has helped me understand how my email address is redistributed and abused in ways I didn't expect. Now, if nothing else, that is good awareness. It is good for people to go, hey, there is this thing. I'm in it. My address has been misused and passed around without my permission. That helps me understand more about the mechanics of how the web works. The other thing it does is it brings to people's awareness how important online security is. And I'll give you an example. one of the things that people keep asking me is they say, well, what do I now do? I don't know if my password was in there. If it was, I don't know what password it is or what service it came from. What do I do? This is a really, really good education opportunity in terms of good account management. Now, if you're listening to this, you know what I mean by that, but most people don't know, or at least don't act on, the fact that they need to have strong, unique passwords across everything. And this is the simplest thing in the world to say, and for many people, about the hardest possible thing to actually do. Now, obviously, things like password managers are a great solution here. So let's sort of answer that question. What do I do? If you had a password manager and every password you had was properly strong, not like the dog's name with just an incremental number on the end of it, also very painful for the dog every time you have to change your password. So not a weak one, like a properly good one. So for example, when I use 1Password, it's just like generate something that's 20, 30, 40 characters, however long the dodgy website that has password length restrictions lets me make it, and just generate random characters. That's a good password. So it's that, and then I have a unique one, obviously, for every website. Now, if that's the case, and you did have a password in this incident, and it was in clear text, and it probably wouldn't be, I'll come back to that. So if you had it there and it was in clear text, the entire scope of your risk is one site. Now, you don't want one site to be hacked, and I understand that you would still like to know what one site that is, but your broad range of risk has suddenly come all the way down to one thing. It's no longer 20 or 30, or in my case, 500 different sites that I have in my password manager. It is one, and that fundamentally changes your risk profile. Also, every password that I saw in that set of data was weak. It was terrible. And I firmly believe the reason why is because a lot of them were cracked out of dodgy password storage. So I mentioned LinkedIn. LinkedIn was in there. LinkedIn, SHA-1, no salt. It was really easy to crack a huge number of those. Professional hash crackers cracked more than 90% within days. The remaining less than 90% bit, or whatever was after that, are going to be passwords that couldn't be cracked because they came out of the likes of 1Password and they were genuinely random strings. I don't have a password in LinkedIn that would have been crackable. It came out of 1Password. It was probably 30 random characters. Heck, even if it was a dozen random characters, genuinely random characters, it is almost certainly not being cracked, let alone very, very long ones. So getting back to the point, if you had a password manager and you had these long, strong passwords, the chances of them appearing in this incident cracked out of these dodgy sort of hashing algorithms is very, very close to nil. So we move on a little bit. What say you didn't have a password manager? Get one. Go and change all your passwords. Because if you didn't, and you're in there, and you've got a dodgy password in there, go and set up every single site to have a strong, unique password. This can be easy insofar as you start with the most important ones. You do your email address, your social media, your banking. You will do all that within the space of a few hours. And if you do that, and one of those passwords was genuinely in that incident, then you've just closed all those doors. The other thing is multi-step. If you have multi-step verification turned on in your things, even if your plain text password was in there because it was crap and it got cracked out of whatever dodgy hashing algorithm was used on whatever website it was, you've shut that door too, because you're not going to be able to do the multi-step thing. So the point I'm trying to make here is that if you are practicing good password management practices, this is a non-event. And I can say that with a really, really high degree of confidence. And really, the only gap we're left with here is what if this great big online spam bot thing aggregated a password in plain text from somewhere else, in which case it didn't matter how strong your password was, nothing had to get cracked because it was in plain text, got it in plain text from some other source, and you didn't have any multi-step verification available on the site, which is possible, and someone else hadn't already been exploiting it because the thing has been socialized for so many years anyway, such as in the LinkedIn data breach. And now we're sort of left with a lot of stuff has got to happen, including almost certainly deficiencies on behalf of the user themselves for this to actually be exploitable in any way. Bottom line is, this is a non-event for people who have good password management practices or who put them in place now. Now, I know not everyone is going to agree with me on this, but I do spend a huge amount of time thinking about this and looking at the data. And if it was my record in there and it was someone else's system and I didn't get to see what password I had, and incidentally, there was no password against my 2 instances of email addresses in there. But if I was in that situation, I wouldn't be at all worried about it. So I hope that that helps explain things. I think one of the things I've found particularly interesting, and the penny dropped at the time of Ashley Madison actually, one of the things that people are most interested in when they ask for their password or their address or their passport number or whatever else was in this particular incident, it's not so much they want to know what it was or that they want to change something. It is very commonly that they want to know what other people know about them. And I get that. They have had their privacy violated and they want to be able to see from an independent third party what was violated. I'm very conscious of that. I don't have a good answer for it for all the reasons I've just described, but I think that that is often what is driving people to request this data. So for example, when you think about incidents where, Ashley Madison's a perfect example, a lot of people came to me and they said, can I have my data? You know, can you go through and, you know, just for me, and there's only like 35 million of me or whatever it was, just go through and get my data so I know what it is. And I'm saying to them, well, it is the data that you entered into the site. You want to know your password, it's the password you put in the site. You want to know your sexual preference, it's the sexual preference you put into the site. You know what you put in, and if you don't know what you put in, go and log in and it will tell you what your sexual preference is. But that was, again, that the penny drop moment where it wasn't so much they wanted to know what it was, they wanted to see what other people were seeing about them. And I think that is a really, really interesting thing. And I certainly do keep giving thought to how I can help try and address that underlying curiosity, because it is a genuine thing. And I totally understand how people feel about that. All right, moving on. The last thing I want to talk about with this spam bot, and you'll get a sense of this if you read the comments on my blog, is to be honest, I was really disappointed with some of the comments. And some of the comments, either on the blog post or on Twitter, were in some cases verging on aggressive, where people were angry either with the fact that I had loaded the data in the first place, or that I wouldn't give them their password, or that I wouldn't indicate that there was actually a password associated with the account. Now, I've just gone through all the reasons explaining all of those things. But the thing that disappointed me, and it's always just a very small fraction of people, the thing that disappointed me is that I sit here like late into the night processing data, paying for these services, not doing other things that could be revenue earning or all the other sorts of things that I'd like to do, playing with my family. And I put this out there and I make it available for people for free, and then people go, you know, this is crap, or this is not what I want, or you should do it better, or you should do it differently. And, you know, constructive input and useful criticism is awesome, but it was really disappointing to sort of see I wouldn't go so far as to say vitriol. There were actually a couple like that, which I won't go into. But the disdain expressed by some people for that. And yeah, I'll be honest, particularly, I think particularly that would have been yesterday, there were moments there I was like I just got to step away from the keyboard for a bit, because this is really pissing me off to see the way people responded to that. And I just hope, and I certainly know that people that are endorsed enough to be watching these increasingly long weekly videos get this, but I just hope that people understand that this is something that I'm trying to do my best at making available for free so that it's useful for people and they can do good things with it. And I would like to think that at worst, if they can't do a good thing with that, or if they find the information is useless, well, then you delete the notification or you go back to doing whatever you were doing, as opposed to taking time out of your day to tell me how much I suck or how useless this particular thing is. So that was frustrating. I saw a greater proportion of that as a result of this incident. And of course, I had a much greater amount of coverage on this incident as well. But it was starting to become somewhat of a head-banging exercise there. Now, amongst all that, there were some genuinely interesting pieces of feedback as well. One of the things I do want to action is that someone made the point that because there was so much junk in this online spam bot thing, when they do things like a domain search, they just see a heap of rubbish in there and some good stuff in there. So what I want to do is add some things like some filters. Like I'd like to just add a filter to say, hey, give me the option not to include data which is flagged as a spam list. And I do have an attribute on each breach, which is whether or not it's a spam list. So that is great feedback, because that's really useful in that it is something that I can do to make things better for other people. Anyway, I think I have spoken enough about that. I do still have a backlog of emails and blogs and tweets and things I've got to go back through and respond to. So when I wrap this up, I'm going to try and finish that. Last stuff this week. This week's sponsor has done very well. So this week's sponsor is Semantics Norton Secured, and they have managed to snare themselves, as I mentioned earlier on, the best ever day on my blog, and that works out really well for them. And just so people know, when I have sponsorship, it is just a flat fee that we agree on in advance. There's no CPMs or things like that, because frankly, I think that model sucks in many ways. So as it turns out, Semantic has done enormously well out of it. So thank you for those guys for being back there again. I think this is the 3rd week they've been there now, and we'll see them a bit more in the future as well. So awesome for those guys. And while I think of it as well, in terms of like massive blog traffic, as much as I had to worry about sort of scaling Azure for Have I Been Pwned, and I mentioned the IFL Science thing where they smashed me out of the park, etc., I never once had to think about the scale of my blog, because it all runs on Ghost Pro. So I pay Ghost Pro to run the service for me, and you can go and get into that for about 62 cents a day. I wrap Cloudflare around that, so a huge portion of the traffic was actually cached by Cloudflare anyway, but I just never had to think about scaling it. And I've said many times before, I've even written a blog post about managed platforms for this sort of thing are awesome. Don't run blog platforms and things yourself. Pay someone else a piddly amount of money, which you'll probably find is payable with pre-tax dollars in many places as well, because it's a professional pursuit, and let them deal with the drama. So thanks very much for Ghost Pro for actually being there and running this service, and also for Cloudflare for making it easier on Ghost Pro and giving everyone nice fast cache stuff. So I'm really happy that I just never had to think about the blog. And again, Semantic, you did very well out of it this week, and thank you for being my repeat sponsor. So that's it. I know this has been a long one. Next week's going to be a lot shorter because I will be in Melbourne with a lot less time free. And again, if you're down that way, I'd love you to come along to the workshop. Last one for the year. And thank you everyone for listening. I'm going to go and keep replying to all of those comments that are still pending. See you later, guys.